Hello everyone, welcome to Self-Knowledge. Today we have our self-knowledge course and we are going to see the topics number 5 and 6 both in one, because we are going to talk about the dimensions and we are also going to talk about where they are in us. So today we will be talking about the different dimensions of nature, their characteristics, who inhabits them, and we will see where these dimensions are within us. Because as without, so within. And if we want to access to the higher dimensions of nature, we need to learn to access and rule our own inner dimensions. That is the interesting thing about this topic. So we will understand that we are a multidimensional being, and we will learn what we can do to become aware of these dimensions, how to verify their existence, and better still, we will learn what we can do to have a conscious and permanent presence in the higher dimensions of nature. So let's start by studying what is the dimension, how many are there, and let's see also each one of them in detail. So what is a dimension? Let's start with that. A dimension is a level of consciousness, and a level of consciousness is a level of wisdom or a level of perception of reality. And it is according to our level of consciousness that we will be perceiving our reality. You can see that a being of awakened consciousness who therefore has a high level of consciousness, a high vibratory level, can not only perceive the higher dimensions, but also he can access all those dimensions at will. He can move in them at will, while being able to perceive all dimensions at once, both higher and lower dimensions. While a being with a low level of consciousness, due to his low vibratory level, he inhabits and is related to the lower dimensions and is not capable of perceiving the reality of the dimensions superior to the one in which he lives. And actually there are many dimensions, or there are as many dimensions as there are levels of consciousness, and each one of us has a completely different level of consciousness. That is why each person perceives reality in a different way. A person with a high level of consciousness perceives reality in a completely different way than a person with a low or a lower level of consciousness. So according to our level of consciousness or our way of perceiving reality, our suffering, our pain, the number of negative thoughts and emotions that we have are actually determined, because we are perceiving reality according to what we are internally, according to our own psychological defects. And if we get to eliminate all our psychological defects, the ones that have trapped and conditioned our consciousness, our level of consciousness will raise. So our perception of reality would change like radically. And immediately I perceive my reality in a different way from a higher perspective. I am no longer in the same dimension, because the lower the dimension, the more intense the pain, the ignorance, the suffering, and the materiality. Instead, the higher the dimension, the more freedom, the more happiness, and the more wisdom. So we can see the dimensions externally as worlds parallel to this third dimension in which we find our physical body. And we can also see them internally as the level of consciousness that we have, or the way in which we perceive our reality. But the external and the internal are completely related, because if I raise my level of consciousness, immediately that gives me access to the higher dimensions in nature. And all the dimensions are synthesized, or are like subdimensions of the 7 basic dimensions of nature that we are going to study today. And we need to know that when our spark, what we are internally, what we really are, our consciousness, emanated from the source, unmanifested God, or absolute Sun, it unfolds through these 7 dimensions, and in each of the unfoldings that the spark made after leaving the absolute, the number of laws and of materiality increased. In the absolute Sun, there, only the law of love governs, only one law. Therefore, there is only like fullness and happiness. But as the creation descends, the different dimensions appear, and as we descend in creation, each unfolding is heavier. Each dimension is governed by more and more laws, and we are having there more limitations, more suffering, and more materiality. It like goes down from the subtle to the dense. As the ego multiplies, the dimensions become heavier, and we fall into lower and lower levels of consciousness. Now, with our physical body, we are in the 3rd dimension. However, our psychology can become in lower dimensions. The more psychological defects a person has, the lower his level of consciousness, and the lower his way of perceiving reality, and his reactions to the different circumstances is like more terrible. He suffers, he hurts others, he hurts himself, he is filled with hatred and resentment, while someone with a higher level of consciousness, for having eliminated all these defects, in the same situation that is like living the other person, he manifests with, in that situation, with understanding and with forgiveness. Therefore, the level of suffering and the materiality for that person is lower, even though they find themselves in the same situations. Because we need to understand that all dimensions are here and now. So now let's see each dimension in detail so we get to comprehend this better. And let's start from the lowest dimension to the highest. So let's see the 1st dimension, which is the lowest one. The 1st dimension, as we learned in geometry, is the length, or the distance between 2 points. Here enters all the distances, or all the linear measures, measures, such as the meter, the kilometer, the rod, etc. And the world that belongs to the 1st dimension of nature is called the tridocosm, also known as hell. This is actually the world of all atoms. And in this world, in the 1st dimension, inhabits all the species of monocerebrates, or creatures that have a single brain, which is the emotional one. We, as human beings, we have 3 brains. We are going to study that now. And in the 1st dimension, we find those creatures that have only 1 brain, which is the emotional one, such as the stones, the minerals, which although we see them inert and we believe they don't have life, actually they have a spark inside. And they not only have life, they do, but they are also capable of liking and disliking. I mean, this spark inside of them. We are going to study that in, we are going to see that topic like in depth in lecture number 8, where we are going to talk about the evolution and the involution of the spark in this creation. And in this world, in the tridacosm, there are also bicerebrate creatures that, in addition to the emotional brain, they also have a second brain, which is the motor instinctive sexual brain, but that don't have a spinal column. Here you see the insects, the worms, and the plants. They all belong to the first dimension. These monocerebrates and bicerebrates without a spine, they perceive the world in a linear way. Although we perceive them as three-dimensional creatures, because a higher dimension can perceive a lower one, they can't perceive us in the same way. They just see us as like points at the end of the line of vision. For example, a fly. They can only see in a linear way, and they see us just like as one point there, but they don't see us like three-dimensionally. The movements of these or the beings that inhabit this dimension is linear. They only move from liking to disliking. They go just from pain to pleasure and back to pain, like, you know, the plants that feels thirsty and is then satiated when someone puts them water, or the insect that needs to reproduce and just go and mate, or that is hungry and look for food, and that's it. That's how their whole existence goes, going from one point to another. And within us, this dimension is located in our sexual glands, in our seminal system. There is our ego. And our ego also moves in a linear way, constantly going from pleasure to pain. And the sub-dimensions in this first dimension goes from 192 laws to 24,576 laws. So we can see that this can get really dense. That is actually hell. And we are going to study the infradimensions in the topic number 9, when we are going to deepen into that, into those sub-dimensions of the first dimension. And well, that is the first dimension. The second one is the surface, or the displacement of a line in space. In this dimension, we find all the bicerebrates that have two brains, the emotional one and the motor instinctive reproductive one, but that also have a spine, like dogs, like cats, like cows, like birds, etc. They can feel, like and dislike, they can also move, they can reproduce, and instinctively they record emotions. So they can record sensations, and thanks to this, option, let's say, or as their instinct is already developed, they feel fear, and they already fear certain states of sadness. And the beings that inhabit these third dimensions perceives reality in two dimensions. So they perceive us as planes, like you see the two-dimensional cartoons that we used to watch on TV, the same way. And this is the world of the 96 laws, and it is called limbo, or the hole of hell. And in this dimension are all the surfaces, or the surface measures, like the square meter, the square foot, the square rod, the square kilometer, etc. They are all the surfaces or things that are given by two dimensions. You know, by length, by width, or by height. And in this dimension, we find our personality and all our superficiality. You know, the appearances of the volumes, the physical forms. And in the first dimension, we saw our ego going in a linear way from pleasure to pain. And in this second dimension, is where our personality moves, which is like that superficiality in us, that appearance that we want to project, that make us to always take like a path different from our ego to get to satisfy ourselves. We can see an example of this when an insect, which belongs to the first dimension, when feels the need to reproduce, to have sex, and in order to reproduce its species, the insect simply goes, looks for someone of the same species, of the opposite sex, and goes and mates. That's it, going from one point to another. But on the other hand, an animal belonging to this dimension already makes like a courtship process to achieve this end. You see, for example, the birds that show their plumage and even do dances with the intention of attracting the female of the opposite sex to reach the point of having sex. And that is because they already have like a superficiality. They have a second dimension. And likewise, our personality represents that appearance, that journey that we take to satisfy our pleasure and to get out of pain. Because if we feel a sexual desire, our ego would just go and find a person and rape him or her. But as we have a personality, as we need to take care of our personality, of our image, of our superficiality, we already make like a courtship process. We make a displacement to get to satisfy the desire, taking care of that appearance. And actually this dimension is quite heavy. It's governed by 96 laws. And these two dimensions, the first and the second one, are what we call or what we know as the infra dimensions, because they are dimensions lower than the third dimension, which is the one in which we live. And well, this third dimension, or it is the dimension of the volume, because here we are going to find all bodies or things with organic or inorganic physical presence, but with three dimensions, with length, by width, by height. So here we find everything that has a volume. Here we find our physical body and all measurements that are cubic, like cubic meter or cubic centimeter, etc. And as we can see, the previous two dimensions are contained in this dimension. And in this third dimension, or physical world, because this is known as the physical world, here inhabit all the tricerebrates bipeds, or rational animals, mistakenly called men, with their three brains: the emotional one, the motor instinctive sexual one, and the intellectual one. And as they already have their third brain, which is the intellectual one, they can actually self-realize, humanizing and like de-animalizing themselves in one of their 108 existences as humans. We have an intellectual brain that already allow us to reflect in our acts, that allow us to judge ourselves, to judge each of our actions. So there is the that is the particular thing that makes us different from the animals of the second dimensions, and there is another thing that makes us different from them. Sorry, and it is that we already have an upright spine, which already like represents that stairway to heaven, or that stairway through which we can raise our kundalini, which is our sexual energy, towards our higher centers or higher dimensions to become self-realized being. What else? Well, this dimension is managed by 48 laws, and its importance lies in the fact that in this dimension we already have a physical body, And our physical body is an energy condenser. I mean, it's a sexual energy condenser. And because of that, when we are united sexually with our partner and we start transmuting that sexual energy, we can get to create the existential bodies of the being, which will allow us to have a presence in the higher dimensions of nature, of which we are going to speak in a moment. And it is important to note that although our physical body moves in this third dimension, our psychology constantly inhabits the second and the first dimensions, because we are constantly moving, or we are constantly moved by our personality and by our ego. And the heavier the psychological defects that manifest in us, the more we go down. I mean, the more loss and our psychology gets subjected to heavier, vibratory level. And we are actually fully living in the third dimension when we can stay like living in the here and now, in the present moment. But actually, the true inhabitants of this third dimension are those that have already, by transmuting their sexual energy, regenerated their physical body, turning them from the lunar state in which our physical bodies currently, to a solar state, and that will give them the power, let's say, to permanently stay in the here and now, living in the third dimension. And well, from now on, let me see, well, in us, this dimension is located in our sexual center at the height of our coccyx bone, and it represents our earth element. And well, from now on, yes, we will speak of something that is probably completely unknown to most, which are the higher dimensions. And the first one of the higher dimensions is the fourth dimension. And it is the dimension of time. And this one belongs to the etheric world, or the world of energy. And it is like the duration of our physical body, or the duration of any volume. The time that elapses between the birth and the end of anything. For example, we as human beings, we have an energy that like covers us, which is our etheric part. Many know this etheric part as the aura. And it is actually our vital body that is also subjected to 48 laws, the same as the physical body, because it is just like the top of our matter. And that is our fourth dimension, our energy. And that energy determines the amount of time that we are going to live. And if by misuse of our internal energies, that are like our internal waters, our sexual energy, we have this etheric body or vital body very like worn out. You know, you see that at a young age, someone who have misused his sexual energy for his whole life, at the age of 30 or 40, you already see them like worn out, like old, like sick, because that fourth dimension is the vitality in us. Is the fourth dimension what gives life to all the beings that inhabit the third dimension, and to those that inhabit the first and the second one, because all those dimensions are contained in this fourth dimension. And the requirement for us to come to rule this fourth dimension is that we begin to make a wise use of our energy, as we were learning in the previous topic, and that we achieve chastity, that is actually the virtue of all those people who learn not to waste their sexual energy, and all the beings that have already regenerated not only their physical body but also their vital body will consciously inhabit and will consciously move in the fourth dimension of nature. This fourth dimension is that parallel world where there are the so-called Jainas paradises, which are actually temples, cities, and places that that we cannot see from this third dimension, but that they already exist, but they exist in a superior dimension. They exist in the fourth dimension. And this fourth dimension is related to what is known as the Bermuda Triangle. Allow me just a second. Okay, sorry. Well, in us, this dimension is located in our instinctive center, that is at the height of the sacrum, and the vital or etheric body, which is the body that moves in that dimension, is who oversees our health, and you see that this body represents our element water. That is because it is like this, like the energy of our physical body. And well, that is the fourth dimension. Let's now look at the fifth dimension, which is very interesting. And this is actually the dimension known as the eternity. Here we also find time, but we find time like continuously, without beginning or end. We find the infinite. Thus, we see all the previous dimensions are contained in this one. And here we find the past, the present, and the future, but continuously. And when we unfold to this fifth dimension, everything is handled in an eternal present. And when we unfold to this dimension, that is when we make our conscious astral unfolding or conscious astral projection, we can actually get to see what happened a long time ago or what will happen in the future as if it is happening at the very moment. And this dimension is subdivided into two worlds. The lower fifth dimension is the astral world, and the upper fifth dimension is the mental world. And they have their corresponding bodies, and they handle different functions, and they have their own characteristic. And in order for us to get to have a permanent and conscious presence in this fifth dimension, we must create our solar astral body and our solar mental body, because right now we just have like some principles of the astral and the mental bodies, let's say like an embryo of these bodies that allow us to unfold, yes, and to do brief investigations in these dimensions. But if we want to have a full presence in the dimensions, we need to create those bodies, and we are going to do that through the sexual transmutation or the suprasexuality. Let's see each one of these worlds. In the lower fifth dimension or astral world is where we find our astral body, or where we move with our astral body. This inside us is located at the height of our emotional center, at the level of the navel and the spine. And this dimension is governed by only 24 laws, half the laws of the physical world. So here in this dimension is like less materiality, and there are fewer limitations. For that reason, you can in the astral world and like move, like fly, like float, like I was explaining in previous lectures, you can like stretch a finger and the finger stretches, and it is because these have fewer laws, but also this astral body is not made of cells like the physical body. It's not of a cellular nature, but it is of a molecular nature. But actually, when you have a nightmare and you are like experiencing like pain or fear or heaviness, it's because you are not in the fifth dimension, but that actually you went down to the infra dimensions, because there is where we live the nightmares. And in the astral world, actually in the fifth dimension, there is much more lightness. Here we move with our astral body and we can actually go and fly. This body manages our emotion, our fire, and this one is controlled by the salamanders that are the elementals of fire. To create this solar astral body and to have a permanent and conscious presence in this dimension, it is necessary that in addition to using our sexual energy for this purpose, it is necessary that also we learn to have a total control of our emotions. That is like a requirement. And well, the upper fifth dimension, which is the mental world, is where consciously live the beings who have already created their solar mental body, who have already regenerated the physical and the vital bodies and have created their astral body and their mental body. So they already have total control over their mind, over the thoughts, and this dimension is located in us at the level of the heart, on the spine, and it is there actually in our heart where intuition resides, which is that capacity of knowing without thinking. And this capacity actually develops when we learned like to control our mind, to silence our mind. That is where true wisdom, which is like the connection with our being, like arises. And this dimension and this mental body is related to the air element, and that is why our thoughts are so like volatile. And it originates our intellect and the way of thinking of each one of our psychological defects, because in our current state, our mental dimension is full of psychological defects. And in this world, we move using our mental body, and as this dimension is governed by only 12 laws, the materiality and the heaviness in this dimension is less. So there is like greater freedom of movement compared to the astral world. When you make a conscious mental projection, and we are going to talk about that in the next Phase B lecture, about a mental unfoldment or projection. When you do that practice and you manage to go to the mental world, you can actually experience how you can move like more freely. It's actually a very good feeling to be under less laws. Here you have only 12 laws. Well, let's now look at the sixth dimension, and this dimension is called the reality or the truth. So here we are going to find what is, what has been, and what will be. And like the previous one, this also is subdivided into two parts: the lower sixth dimension or causal world, and the upper sixth dimension or buddhic world. And here we find the electromagnetic worlds and the planets of the Christ. And It is to this dimension, actually, where those who through a transcendental meditation reach the samadhi or the illuminating void, like escape and experience that happiness, that freedom of being under only 6 laws, which are the laws that govern this 6th dimension. And well, in the lower 6th dimension, which is the causal world or the world of conscious will, we find our body of the will or causal body. And this body is governed by 6 laws. This is of an electrical nature because it is formed by all the electrons of our atoms. And it is interesting to see that electrons are the negative parts of the atoms, and in relation to our willpower, you can see that our willpower actually develops when we improve our ability to deny ourselves to our desires, to the desires of our psychological defects. And well, this body represents our verb. You will find this body here in this dimension here at the height of the larynx, and this is the world of all causes. And let's see what else. All the beings that inhabit this dimension are the one who had the will to deny themselves, to dominate like their inner nature, and that have created the 5 bodies: the physical, vital, astral, mental, and causal solar bodies that actually make them now true men. So all the ones who reach this point will have already created their human soul. So they are already true men. And well, when you create this causal world, this causal body, you already can inhabit permanently and consciously this lower 6th dimension. And the upper 6th dimension, which is the Buddhic world or the world of consciousness, is what is commonly defined as heaven. And this is governed by 6 laws, and this world is magnetic in nature. And it is formed by all the protons of the atoms, which are the positive charge of the atoms. And in this world, we can already perceive what is actually the reality, what is the truth. And we, as human beings, believe here in this 3rd dimension that we can perceive the reality, or that we can get to know the truth here with our mental concepts that we have about anything. But actually, we can only here perceive things as we are, according to our psychological defects. You see that a thief perceives everyone as thieves. I don't know, lustful people perceive everyone as, everywhere he sees lust. And an envious one perceives everyone with envy, and they think that everyone is envious. So we only see our defects reflected in others, and we tend to judge people according to our own mental condition. So we are not able here to really perceive reality. We see people from our concepts, from our beliefs. But one who have already mastered this dimension, having done the work of inner work and inner purification that requires to eliminate our psychological defects and raise our level of consciousness to this level, that person can really perceive the reality of things and have the right to inhabit this Buddhic world. Those who, having already created their human soul, which are the previous 5 bodies, have joined their divine soul or Buddhic body, and have achieved that are known as the perfect matrimony, that is the union inside of the human with the divine. And that is the joint between the Buddhic body and the causal body. And that Buddhic body is already in a solar state. We don't have to create it. We just have to create our human soul so we can join our divine soul. And in us, this Buddhic world is located here in the pituitary gland, which is in this point here. And well, let's now see the last dimension, which is the seventh dimension. And in this dimension, there are only three laws. So here, happiness and freedom are something, amazing. And here is the world of light, or the Atmic world. Here we meet our intimate, which is our inner being. And the beings that inhabit this dimension are beings with 100% awake consciousness, enlightened masters. And this dimension is known as the Great Truth or the Great Reality. And a being at this point can fully perceive reality. He sees a person and he sees his inner being, his consciousness, the spark that lives inside that person. And he can actually see everything that spark has lived throughout his manifestation in this wheel of samsara. He doesn't see a concept like we see, but he already sees the reality of that person. So a seventh dimensional being can already see the truth, reality in a totally objective way. This dimension is photonic in nature, and the photon is like already light. It is wisdom. And in us, it is located in our pineal gland, and it is from where the understanding and the wisdom that reaches our heart through intuition comes down. And we need to know that we still don't have full access to these superior dimensions because we are like disconnected from our own divinity. But when we begin to start working on ourselves, to start denying our desires, denying our psychological defects, eliminating them, and we start making a wise use of our energy, these two dimensions start like entering into activity in us and start to guide us in this inner path to self-knowledge or self-realization. And well, this seventh dimension is actually the lowest that our being can reach, since our being comes from the world of antimatter, which is the absolute sun. And when a person, as I was saying, achieves samadhi through meditation, he can get even to connect for a while with this dimension, with his inner being. And there he receives wisdom, and he receives guidance, and he comes back. And the Atmic body, which is the body that moves in this dimension, is like the Christ principle in each one of us. He is like our particular warrior. And the Atmic body is also in a solar state. It didn't fall either. It is raised in each one of us, waiting for us to get to connect to those internal superior bodies. So, well, these are the 7 basic dimensions of nature. And as we can see, as we go up in the dimensions, they are like lighter in nature. We come from the physical body that was like cellular in nature. We went to the vital body that was like energetic or etheric. And there we go to the astral body or astral world that was molecular. Then we went to the mental world that was molecular, atomic, then electronic, electronic, protonic, and then photonic. So you see that it goes from the dense to the subtle. And well, now let's see what are the methods with which we can begin to check and to know these higher dimensions, I mean from now on. And we can visit this dimension using different techniques. But actually, for us to perceive the third dimension, the only requirement is for us to be living in the present moment, in the here and now. That is the only requirement. And for us to experience the fourth dimension, the requirement is that we practice the jhanas state. We are going to talk about that in later topics. And to access to the astral world or lower fifth dimension, we can do that by practicing the astral projection that we learned in the topic number 3 of this course. And to know the mental world, which is the upper fifth dimension, we can do that by practicing the mental unfolding or mental projection that we are going to teach later, and to get to visit the sixth dimension, the lower sixth dimension, which is the causal world, the upper sixth dimension, which is the bodic world, and the seventh dimension. We can do that through the transcendental meditation. And here in the self-knowledge course, we are going to teach a practice for to achieve this this state, which is the samadhi or the illuminating void, known as the meditation with koans. We are going to see that in later topics. And these are like the ways to visit these dimensions. But what is important for us to know is that we cannot like only settle for visiting these dimensions occasionally, but we must have a permanent presence in this in the higher dimensions, and we are going to be able to do that with the practice of the 3 factors for the consciousness revolution, that are the psychological death, the spiritual birth, and the sacrifice for humanity. The psychological death is to work on our own psychology and practice the self-observation, that is to send at all times, from moment to moment, the attention to our inner world. And with that, we are going to get to discover all the manifestations of our ego through our mind, emotion, when we are talking, when we are acting, and we are going to be able to discover when, for example, the anger is manifesting in us, or when is the impatience, or when it's manifesting, lust, or laziness, or envy, or jealousy, or pride, whatever. If we are in that state of self-observation, we can discover when a psychological defect, that all our psychological defects make up our ego and are the ones who have trapped and conditioned 97% of our consciousness. So when we get to observe a psychological defect manifesting in our thoughts, for example, what we do is that we judge that, we get to know that it's actually a psychological defect that is coming to feed on our energy, to make us make mistakes, to harm others, to harm ourselves. So what we do, we need to eradicate that from us. And we can do that with a simple request to the part of our consciousness that has the power to eliminate everything that is wrong in us. And that is our Divine Mother, which is the part of love of our consciousness. So we ask her, Divine Mother, eliminate this defect that is manifesting, and you are going to experience how every detail, because it is good to ask for depth to all the details that we manage to observe in ourselves that are part of our ego, and when you keep like asking her to eliminate this and this detail and this manifestation of the ego, you start experiencing like the relaxation process, and you start experiencing like the how more and more of your essence is like getting free. So now you can actually start feeling like more like lighter. Yeah, because with the psychological death, actually we are liberating our essence. And with the spiritual birth, what we do is that we take all that energy and all that consciousness that we are liberating with the psychological death, and we fix them in our spinal column. So we start creating those existential bodies of the being. And we do that by practicing the suprasexuality that we already talked from the first topic, and that we are going to be talking about that practice, the suprasexual practice, in later topics, like for example in topic number 10, where we are going to be talking about the 7 bodies and their characteristics. And the third factor for the revolution of the consciousness is a sacrifice for humanity. And what is a sacrifice for humanity? It is helping others to awaken. It is taking part of our time to try to help others to receive this knowledge, to know that they can do an internal work that will allow them to awaken their consciousness and to experience and to have presence in higher dimensions of consciousness as they like raise their level of consciousness. And this is a sacrifice for humanity. And actually, by practicing these 3 factors, we can start raising our level of consciousness, and we can start creating the existential bodies that will allow us to have presence in all those dimensions. And well, this has been today's topic. Thank you very much to all who watched the video. And I want to invite you to our next topic that will be next Wednesday, where we are going to be talking about the conjurations. That is a very important topic, because in that one we are going to learn how to clean our environment from bad energies, how to protect our energy, and also to protect ourselves from the sleep paralysis, and also how to unmask false beings of light or fake masters that we can find in the astral world. So don't miss that lecture next Wednesday, and thank you very much to all of you, and have a great rest of the night. Ciao, ciao.